Welcome to the Story Tinker Podcast, a place for in-depth analysis of webtoon stories. Co-hosted by sharp, witty, and dare I say thirsty fans, we dive deep into every episode, analyzing character struggles, relationship development, and of course, theories. You can follow the Story Tinker on YouTube, podcast platforms, and social media. For bonus content, sneak peeks, and more, you can support the Story Tinker on Patreon. We are really appreciative of your likes, subscribes, and follows on all platforms. Thank you for listening to the Story Tinker, and let's get started. Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to episode 43, the episode that must not be named, Murderous Monster, of the Purple Hyacinth podcast on the Story Tinker. And today we have Vita and Fwoot and Allo.
Hello.
Hello.
How's it going, guys?
What?
How's it going?
Well, it's gonna be quite the episode. As we all know, this episode is basically the most famous episode in all of Purple Hyacinth, and it's not very funny. I don't know why I'm laughing. So let us begin. We start out with Lauren, who has just come in. Just a recap, she has just like run into the cave. Kieran was just sitting there in his rocking chair looking like a dandy, all dressed up. And we discussed kind of the significance of that last time. So he says, well, officer, what a delightful surprise. And there's actually dubs of this, by the way. If you want to go on YouTube, type in like Purple Hyacinth 43 dub or whatever. There's for sure one, if not more than one dub that are fun to listen to. So check those out. And, you know, Kieran, of course, his opening is trying to minimize any, trying to basically put, ignore what just happened, but in a way that he knows that it's just a joke. He understands that that's not really going to be effective. And Lawrence is Kieran with this look of murder on her face. And he's like, want to grab a cup of coffee and chat about our old days? I've been craving some. Had a pretty late night, And he smiles, and you just want to kill him at this moment.
I mean, he's just poking her buttons in this moment right now.
I don't think that, like, me being the person that I am, I could never have the straight audacity that Kieran has to, like, look Lauren in her murderous eyes and then joke about it, Like, I could never.
It's a death wish.
Yeah. I think that just zooming in on that first panel too, where we just see Lauren, that is how you know there's going to be a huge tonal change within this episode. The authors obviously put so much more detail just to start off with to show that murderous intent in her eyes. Well, actually, maybe not so much murderous, but like Yuri. And I just really love how they can bring through horror aspects with their work, and we definitely see more of that as we continue in this episode.
I also think it's really interesting looking at like the transition in terms of the lighting, like because in the last episode in 42 there was a very clear transition between when Lauren had left the like announcement made by King Philip, and then in going to the cave, you see the lighting kind of change from like a not really like golden happy, but very like obviously a like more like brighter and just light in terms of like more positive lighting. And then when you get to the panels where she's in Kieran's cave and then throughout 43, it's very like dark and has very like cold lighting, which I think was really cool, and it kind of like helped set the tone because it's not lighthearted anymore, like it's not funny anymore, like what's been going on. Mm-hmm. So I think that the lighting really helped to convey all of that.
Yeah, and you see it especially more on the first panel of Lauren, and then a few panels after that, where it's Kieran saying had a pretty late night. the lighting is, it's a very sickly, incredibly pale greenish blue on it. So there's no warmth, no comfort. It's just dead serious. And you know that this episode is going to be like a complete opposite from whenever we saw these two characters last together.
Extreme contrast from when she was in his house. So Lauren goes, she has that look of disgust. You know, there's like 5 primary emotions that psychologists have like categorized like facial expressions to. It's a fear, happiness, anger, surprise, and disgust. So that's the classic disgust expression where you lift up one side of your mouth. And she says, I know what you did last night. And Kieran's like, I can't help but laugh. His reaction is so absurd. You do? You know, it's not really nice to spy on me. And she just dumps her coat on the floor and screams, you brutally slaughtered dozens of innocent people at the tower and murdered everyone we exposed. And Kieran's like, my, news travels fast. Am I famous yet? And he laughs. Ugh. And Lauren grabs him by the front of his shirt and screams, like her face is up in his face, and screams, is this a joke to you? How the hell could you do this? How could you be so nonchalant after what you did mere hours ago? And she pushes him away. How can you even bear to live with yourself with so much blood on your hands? And then she has, you know, that's her very emotional reaction, which is like a very human reaction. She's talking about the moral perspective, you know, how could you do this? And then she has a rational moment, which shows that she isn't completely removed from reality. She says, the leader may order you to strike, but there's not a shred of remorse in you. Just how heartless are you? And then we have a panel of just Kieran's mouth, like his lower face. And that set of his mouth, to me, already shows like the show is off. He's not pretending to be nonchalant and smirking anymore. He has a very grim and bitter set because he's being yelled at for something that he really agrees with.
Mhm.
It's very like it gives off like very much when you kind of are being like, obviously when you're being scolded by like either a really close friend or sometimes like a parent, and they almost tell you like things that you know are true and you genuinely don't want to hear it, but like it's for your betterment at this point in this context. Like it's not helping either of them to kind of like be digging into like older wounds or whatever. But I think like it very much reads if it were in a different context of, you know, this person murdered a tower full of people. I think if it were in a lesser kind of context, it would read as like someone's like genuinely scolding you on something you did wrong and like mostly for your benefit. But I think like here I'm sorry, I'm struggling to kind of get my thoughts together, but it reads almost like my first kind of impressions while like going through this panel was very much it seemed like, you know, not in the sense that blame was being shifted, but it very much seemed to be calling out all of the things that the audience themselves were ignoring, and in turn Lauren was kind of ignoring herself, like in her saying like the leader may order you to strike, but you have no remorse about doing it. It's almost kind of calling out like the excuses in a sense, quote unquote, that the audience is kind of making, like, oh, he doesn't really want to be following these orders, while also simultaneously ignoring the fact that he talks about his murders up until this point in a very like lighthearted way or like deflecting way, which I think is interesting. Like this episode kind of seems like a call out to the romanticization of like murderers and or like serial killers in like a media setting.
Yeah, this episode is a reminder to not just Lauren, like this whole arc is a reminder to not just Lauren, but to us as well as the readers, that this is who Kieran is. Like, Kieran is a murderer, and we kind of forget that because, you know, we see Kieran as this flirtatious vigilante who goes around at night just catching bad people and, I don't know, having sexual tension while like dancing in a like club floor, or like stitching up your wounds or something. Like, those are, you know, better memories and better ideas that we have of Kieran. And so like it's easy to forget that Kieran has killed a lot of people, for better, like whether they were good people or whether they were bad people. He did kill them. And we do learn later in this episode that Kieran, it's implied very heavily that Kieran has also killed children before. And when it like, and I don't know, it's like something that we probably just should have kept in mind all this time, but we, like Lauren, we got so comfortable around Kieran that like as an audience, we lost our edge around him. And this episode, as like shocking as it was to read, it's very honest and it's very truthful in its message, because this is the reality of PH and this is the reality of Kieran.
Yeah, just to add on to that too, it kind of, in a weird way, reminds me of the dynamic between my boyfriend and I, or sorry, fiance. It's been recent and I still can't get used to the change. Where I am very hot-headed, and he knows that about me, and sometimes I will get really heated on a topic, and his coping mechanism in dealing with me is humor. And it's kind of like this vicious cycle where I want him to change and then he's laughing, but it's his way to cope with my anger. And I see a lot of that reflected in this dialogue too, where she's obviously very heated. This is a very serious topic. And Kieran, I think, is trying to cope both with her anger and also, you know, the situation itself through humor, through sarcasm, because that's how he's been able to survive while being in the Phantom Scythe. And there reaches a point where, you know, there's a boiling point, and this also goes back to my fiance and I, where it's not funny anymore, and where there's a reality that is that hits home. And like you were mentioning before about feeling scolded, feeling bad, like feeling like a naughty little kid, there's like a switch, and then suddenly it's not constructive anymore, and now you have two angry people instead of one trying to cope and one just being heated. And we see a pretty big switch in Kieran's whole demeanor.
Yeah.
And yeah, so that's that switch. You know, you see it. He's the next panel where you see his whole face. That humor is gone. He is just serious, and it hurts to see his face. And this whole chapter is pivotal because it addresses the whole problem that really, you know, interplays between Kieran and Lauren, the fact that he's a killer, and when you align yourself with someone like that, you're going to come up with these horrible moral dilemmas and issues. But it's so sad to see his face. And this chapter is amazing because yes, we do have to learn that he's done horrible things, like terrible things, but we also still feel so much compassion for him. And that face where you just see his world shattering, like the only person in his life who wasn't viewing him with disgust and dismay and despair, the only person, now she's mad at him for the thing that he hates himself for already. And it's just that one person is gone, and now everyone hates him. It's so poignant and sad to see that face. Ugh.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, because I think like Kieran in this episode is approached with such like nuance because it's calling out the thing that everyone kind of, it was getting on people's nerves already. Like, he's just joking about the fact that he's murdering people. Like, what? That's not okay. But then you also kind of see those nuances where you can see in his face that he's not happy at all with what
Yeah.
he's done, but he doesn't know how else to cope with it that won't completely destroy his psyche.
Exactly.
So like,
Mhm.
it's really interesting to kind of like see it in his face while also agreeing with everything that Lauren is saying. Like, he is coming across as heartless, and we shouldn't just negate that fact just because we know that he isn't heartless, if that makes sense. Like what, as you know, the episode progresses, we can see a truly like dark side of him that no one is comfortable with seeing. However, it's really important to kind of see those like nuances, especially as we move forward in like future episodes and you kind of start unpacking him as like not a monster, quote unquote.
Just someone
It's,
who's done
yeah.
monstrous things.
Yeah, if for Kieran, I feel like this episode is just the confirmation of everything that he hated about himself, as you
Yeah.
guys were saying, because like, in public, he is sort of a public figure. Like, people do know about him because he is very infamous for his kills and his signature with leaving behind the flowers. So, people probably called him like a monster and such, like just in normal life, but they don't know him personally. So he's probably able to brush it off more. But here in this episode, it's someone that he knows that's mad at him, and for good reason. And when because both of them are escalating at this point, none of them are trying to reason. Like, Lauren's escalating because she's angry. Kieran's escalating because he's trying to avoid. He's, I mean, he dropped the mask, but he is sort of like trying to. I don't know how to say this.
The argument almost has all the makings of
Yeah.
that of a toxic or like abusive relationship where they aren't arguing to have a meeting point or to like improve on what's going on around them or between them. It's purely Lauren venting her frustrations with him brushing off things that are important and him not knowing how to placate that the like nature of her temper. And then it's
Mhm.
just it's stoking a flame, or rather it's like, you know, a ticking time bomb in a sense. So it's very like, I think like if I can't even imagine a different direction that this episode could have gone because it's so like iconic in its nature. But I think that if it were to go in a different direction where they could come to like a compromise, I can't even imagine that happening. But I think that it's very like it definitely paints a really big picture or idea that is underrepresented in media when we think about what a toxic relationship is. This actually is a very amazing subversion of like couple arguments that you see in other kind of medias where they're angry at each other but it never really gets addressed, and then or is rather like swept under the rug as the story progresses.
Mhm.
But here it's very much like everything that you see in real life arguments or in arguments between like couples that are unhealthy or toxic in a sense. So I think that's also like something to note.
Yeah. And building off that, Lauren's lashing out for the sake of being angry. She's not they're neither of them are being constructive right now. Like as you were saying, Lauren, they have a problem, right? And so Kieran killed a bunch of people, right, that were important to Lauren. He didn't tell her or give any warning, and now she's mad about it because, you know, he killed innocent people, which were the guards, right? And then he also killed Onslow, but Kieran doesn't know about that yet, I think.
Well, that's what's interesting,
But-
though, because I feel like a normal response would be Lauren's. Like,
Yeah, it is a normal response, but she is lashing out right now in anger. Neither of them are trying to be productive and solve their problems. They're only escalating. Lauren, I think Allo said this, Lauren is lashing out, right? And then Kieran is just keeping a mask on, right? Neither of them are trying to reason with the other. None of them are trying to understand the other's point of view. And that is, like, as Allo said, that is the makings of a toxic relationship where they're not really listening to one another in a productive or healthy way.
As someone who
yeah,
has, sorry, go ahead, Vita.
yeah, no, it's just interesting because usually you would, like, in a regular relationship, it would be bickering over, you know, where you put your clothes or doing the dishes or taking out the trash. It's just interesting that she uses, like, they use, as you guys mentioned, this is a real life relationship dialogue. It's just the reason why they're even arguing to begin with is so extreme. Like, he killed people, like, period. He killed people. That's definitely something to lose your cool over. And especially, yeah, so I think that's the only thing that I really wanted to drive home. Like, this is extreme.
Oh, yeah, of course.
To a certain extent, like Lauren's reaction, even though it is out of anger, even though it is a toxic relationship, everyone's on her side. Like, no one disagrees, including Kieran, that this wasn't like an atrocious thing that he did.
Sorry, I didn't mean to make it seem like I'm not mad at Lauren in any way, because her anger is, like, very understandable in this point, and it is incredibly justified. Like, we are all feeling what Lauren is feeling right now towards Kieran.
Yeah.
And I mean, that is the problem with them right now, right? Because Lauren, I think it's mainly just them not being able to understand the other at this point because they're still so early on in their relationship. And while we have been comparing them to romantic couples, like in real life, these two aren't romantically involved yet. They have no massive emotional attachment to the other, or have been avoiding one, because this was purely for business, and this is when it got personal, and this is what happened when it got personal. And yeah, because they have no reason to try and work it out right now. They have no reason to try and understand the other's point of view. Kieran just wants to get out of this because I don't think he wants to be confronted emotionally right now, which is why he was more playful at the beginning of this episode.
Yeah.
And Kieran, and then Lauren wants he wants to express her anger. So because none of them are trying to be, like, have a healthy dialogue, and because if they did, I'm sure Lauren would realize that Kieran doesn't really have a choice in all of this, right? And I think once Lauren realizes that, their relationship is going to be able to progress in a better light, because she's going to understand that a lot of the things that Kieran has done, he did have no control over because of the Phantom Scythe. And that is, like, in the tower incident, right? And she does realize this in episode 90, right? When she's talking to Abel Sandman, where, you know, the Phantom Scythe people are blackmailed. They don't have much control over their actions. And I think, yeah, that conversation, if these two like were willing to actually talk to one another, that conversation could have happened like 45 episodes earlier-ish.
Yeah, I
But
think
yeah, I mean, these two they need more character development at this point, and that's why this happens, because they haven't progressed far enough in their relationship and with themselves, and that's the
so
beauty of the first season.
Mhm. And I'm going to make a point. I think that Lauren is more ready to see reason because she gives him an out right away. She gives him an out, you know, like, oh, the leader may order you to strike. She knows that, and she does tell him that. But Kieran, and you know, this goes back to like what you were saying at the Allo, that he doesn't know how to placate her. Kieran, like the best case response would be, you know, kind of maybe not before, because we discussed like it would be probably not good advisable to tell her before he killed him, but you know, immediately after, he could have gone and sent her a message and say, listen, I had to do this, I'm sorry, I know you're probably mad at me, but I have no choice, blah blah blah. But
Yeah.
Kieran is not, he's never been in a relationship with someone, and I don't mean romantic relationship, he's never had any kind of person where you had to be accountable to in that sense. And I honestly think that he doesn't know how to love himself enough to protect himself like that. I think that he feels he deserves all the hatred, and I think he invites it upon himself with his constant sarcasm and egging, and he makes her say these horrible things, or he provokes her to say these horrible things by acting horrible. And I think part of it is because he thinks he deserves to get yelled at, and also he doesn't know any other way to talk. I don't think he's ever had a good model for how to speak respectfully and how to resolve conflict with other people. And he definitely doesn't seem to have any relationships in his recent past. So we don't know about his childhood, but his recent past seems to have been very isolated. So it seems he's just built himself a very defensive wall. And that's just what he naturally reverts to: sarcasm and, masking his feelings. He doesn't know how to speak in a more authentic manner. And he's just digging his own hole. It's so sad to see.
Yeah, I think it's very reminiscent of like the phrase like people who grow up in abusive environments tend to pick up traits of said environment or of said abusers. Or, on a lesser scale, if you're in a toxic environment and you grow up in that environment, you tend to pick up the mannerisms and the idiosyncrasies of that toxic environment. And I think that that's very much Kieran's relationship with the Phantom Scythe, where to our knowledge, he hasn't been shown compassion in a sense of, or hasn't been shown compassion long enough for it to imprint on his like outward disposition towards other people. Like the people around him are all just like the worst, like in every sense of the word. Even his relationship with like Bella is just laden with resentment and like just horrible things being said to and from each other. So like for him to meet like Lauren, who arguably, like, while she isn't like the most polite person who's talking to him, you at least as their relationship develops over the course of season 1, you can tell that, she's a lot kinder than the people he's been surrounded with in his whole life, and he doesn't know how to interact with people like that. So here it's kind of like it would be kind of similar to seeing like someone you look up to, or like the one good thing in his life kind of turning around and being exactly like the people he had been surrounded by for his entire life. And that kind of like dissonance, I think, is kind of his breaking point at this point in the story. Is that justifying anything he did to her. No, of course not. I would never say that it is, but I do think that it is very much like an amalgamation of everything that he's experienced with other people, being his default with how he deals with Lauren's anger. Like if, say, the Scythe members dealt with him through like physical violence, that would be reflected in how he treats Lauren later in this episode.
100%. And so Lauren continues shouting at him and says, do you actually enjoy it? Maybe it makes you proud to be the most dreaded assassin the city has ever known. And that is definitely coming out of like spite and anger. That's already a personal dig. And Kieran, his face just goes cold. And again, there's this, his responding in like the way that he knows, which is not the protective way, and says, and what exactly would you do if I said yes? What if I enjoy watching my targets scream and squirm as the blood drains from their bodies? And the way that he's saying it, beg for their help as their lives wither away. Like, we know as readers, he's mentioning the things that kill him inside. We know for sure that the fact that this is the first thing to come to his mind is because this guilt is just eating him away. And he is just like seeing these nightmarish images in front of him all the time. It's not at all that he enjoys it. He's being hyper sarcastic, but in a way that, like, when someone says, my husband is very dry humor, and unfortunately, like when he says things like, he puts himself down a lot, and he'll say, he would say things like, just very hopeless kind of things, and like he puts it in a humorous sense, but he's actually being serious if you know him well, and it's so tragic and sad to see that.
I just wanted to mention too, in the panel before where we see his serious face, I think that's a really nice parallel to the first image that we see of Lauren with her really serious face. It's kind of, they're mirroring each other in the tonal exchange throughout the entire episode. And then he's actually very clever in the way that he responds too, because not only is he, like you mentioned, saying his own insecurities about himself and his own hatred about himself, but he's answering her question with a question to play upon her doubts about him, and in a way to confirm it, because he knows that she's like a human lie detector and would be able to sense any other kind of lie, which ends up being really important at the end. But he doesn't want to tell Lauren more about himself. He wants to feel that remorse, feel that anger, and have someone yell at him, because he doesn't enjoy it, and he feels that he deserves whatever is coming to him right now from Lauren.
Yeah, I think that's so smart that you mentioned that he phrases it in a way where she won't, if he says, I enjoy it, I love watching them, die painfully, she'll know right away that he's lying. That is just so clever. It's so sad where he makes people hate him. It's just so self-defeating.
Yeah,
Kieran, he uses questions and half-truths for like the entire episode, almost the entire episode, so Lauren doesn't pick up on it, and he only slips up at the end when it just reaches an emotional peak.
Yeah, the youth.
I think sorry,
Fwoot, go ahead.
oh sorry sorry, I was gonna say I think this is just Kieran accepting defeat, sort of. I don't know, he doesn't seem very hopeful right now, and I think by asking her these questions, he's just giving up that he could be anything more and that anyone else would believe in him like this, because it would just become this endless cycle of him trying to make reparations and trying to reach out to people, and then them turning away when he is forced to do something incredibly immoral. And it's, if this person that he thought he could be, or this person he thought he could be close to, and this person that he was growing a relationship with, seeing them become, as I think Allo said, seeing them basically just become a branch of the same toxic environment that he was stuck in. Like, I don't know if he really sees a point in continuing after this. So this is him just driving Lauren away as a coping mechanism.
Yeah, the use of rhetorics in this episode is amazing. I resign myself as an F stan for the writing alone, but in this episode specifically, like the bulk of his like kind of monster monologue, it's basically just him listing his crimes, or like the most notable ones of, you know, just a general trigger warning for like, the graphicness, but like him carving out a man's heart and then mailing it to his loved ones, or just like a lot of his crimes and stuff. Like he never gives explicitly like his personal opinion on how he felt during it. I think the closest that we ever got was when he was talking about what he did to the family and how he waited for the father to come home, and he described the face as unforgettable, which is like the most that we could have gotten out of a like personal feeling without it being personal. I love that whole monologue, but it's just kind of like the use of like rhetorics and half truths and him listing like his crimes without ever giving his input on it kind of is such a departure from the way that the fandom has interpreted Kieran, in a sense, where, you know, we tend to interpret him as like very much an open book, or at least with Lauren, and he has his heart on his sleeve, and you can very much kind of read the way that he like feels or whatever. Or the most popular one is he has a difficult time lying to Lauren, which is true in a sense, but also not. But here you can kind of see that he knows exactly how to get around her ability, and to furthermore, to paint a picture of himself that feeds into what she's already established to have thought about him in the first place, without ever like hinting at it being true or untrue. The most that you could have, the one single lie that he told in that whole episode, he likely didn't expect to be a lie. Or at least he didn't expect it to come out as a lie. Like he fully believes that he's a monster, and tried and failed to convince himself that he always was a monster. So I think that I could talk for hours, but we don't have the time to talk about the writing in this episode. But it was stellar. I love that whole monologue.
Yeah, and let's catch up with the panels because we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves.
Yeah.
So let's just read through the next, because there's a lot to discuss. So she says, when he says that, she says, you disgust me. You probably known for a while you'd have to kill them, and yet you said nothing. And Kieran again puts on that mask. He just gets more and more distant. I didn't know we had to tell each other everything about our hobbies. And she says, how could I trust you after this, Kieran? And this is a personal argument. This is not a moral argument. This is a me and you thing. Hell, what am I even doing with you? And it just gets more and more personal as she goes on. It was stupid of me to believe you could be human even for a second. Now she's getting into the ad hominem attacks. It's very personal. You're nothing but a monster. And this is clearly Kieran's trigger word, because we see black setting, the word monster repeated in hazy letters again and again and again. Kieran's face in the shadows, his eyes wide open, he's looking down at her. This has clearly gone straight to his heart. And that is like the turning point. We have, again, monster, and then we have Kieran outlined in black looking monstrous, this very cartoony monster figure image of him. And now he snaps. So he goes, doesn't want to say something before we go read through the next couple of panels?
Well, I was just going to say that Kieran was speaking in hypotheticals, as we noted earlier, and Lauren, being Lauren, just completely took them for truths, which is what led her to be personal, because she's making assumptions right now. She's making, like, Kieran's asking her what if, like, he's asking her all these what if questions, and she's just being like, yes, this is the truth. And so I think now Lauren is starting to doubt herself because the questions get personal, and she's like, what am I doing with you? Like, was I wrong for teaming up with you? Did I like enable this? Because Lauren is probably feeling a lot of doubt after the tower incident, because she did technically play a part in it. Like, she did help get the loon convicts in jail because she was loon. And like, I mean,
Get him killed.
if she, yeah, which is what got them killed. So
Yeah.
She's also too angry
I
to.
think that's
oh,
She's too
I
angry to
also,
read them straight. When
I
people
also
are
think Lauren,
emotional.
oh, sorry.
Go
Go
ahead.
ahead. Oh, I'm so sorry. I was going to say that I also think Lauren is just feeling kind of helpless right now, because as we learn in, you know, the finale of season 1, she blames herself for the deaths of other people, and she's probably reliving some of that guilt right now, because she knows Kieran. She might feel like she could have stopped it or prevented it or something if he had told her, but he didn't tell her, and now she can't do anything. They can only deal with the fallout.
I think what's interesting too, especially about this back and forth, it shows us how blind Lauren can be. There's been, it just shows a weakness with her talent. I think she's definitely over reliant to the point where she fails to read people as well. And there's a lot of illusions that she's failing in other ways too, where she's misinterpreting signs and dialogue from other people in her life. I don't want to get into specifics. So I think it's really interesting too that it's highlighting Lauren's weakness in particular, where she's just not thinking clearly, especially because she's in this heightened emotional state as well.
Yeah.
And then as we go through the panels, again, I thought this episode was so freaking cool. When I was reading through it, it just felt horror. Like, I just kept thinking horror or thriller. Like, it's incredible. And we see that with, like, you just see the whites of Kieran's eyes and his shock and his, you know, he's obviously getting triggered by what she's saying. And that word has special meaning to him that, again, you can't talk about details in particular, but that's the right word to call it. He is absolutely triggered. And we see that repeating in the background, and you just see this really bizarre shape of a human, and it almost looks like a specter or a ghost. And again, just this transition into something that is supposed to make you feel like uncomfortable as you read it was just so masterfully done.
Yeah, F's writing and then Soph's art, like, combined, make this like one of the best, if not the best, webtoon episode like I've ever read personally. It's an amazing culmination of a ton of buildup and foreshadowing, and then just a ton of talent and skill from the creators. And even the music in this episode is absolutely amazing and sets a perfect tone for the content that the episode is about to get into. It's you know, the music in this episode, I believe the track is called Dissonance, it makes you want to crawl out of your skin. And so all of that, like, just grouped together, it makes an absolutely iconic episode on the Webtoon platform.
So now let's read through the panels of his reaction, at which point he is not being logical at all. It's his gut emotions coming out, and he starts laughing, which again is a reaction that a lot of people have either when they're panicking or when they're stressed. So obviously it seems very incongruous, but honestly, anybody who's familiar enough with humans knows, and who has been through it themselves, people laugh when they're nervous very often. So he starts laughing and Lauren's in shock and he covers his eyes and he's like, "You thought I was human? What a monumentally stupid mistake, darling." And that panel, he picks up his hand and he has one eye that's like non-existent, it's sunken, and one eye that's gleaming. And it's so perfectly done to show that he is a monster.
Yeah, as soon as Lauren calls him a monster, as soon as he gets that confirmation that that's how she views him, that's how everyone views him, basically, even the person closest to him, that's when he just drops everything and just plays the part of the monster. He gives up, like, trying to be sane, and he just gives in to whatever one believes him to be.
And I think what he believes himself mostly to be, and Allo, except for with that little line that you mentioned that he said, he does almost entirely, he really believes himself to be a monster. So, and it's his worst fears as well. And he continues, he says, "I'm impressed, actually." Spreads out his hands, his whole dramatic flair. "You must be the only person delusional enough to believe that." And then he walks closer to her, intimidating, obviously. "You knew who I was when we made our deal." And this is kind of him answering back. This is a kind of a little bit more of a rational thing he's saying. "You should have known what was waiting for you. What did you think you'd find underneath?" Now, this part to me is the most painful thing that he says, because it's just showing how much he really doesn't think of himself as valuable anymore. He really doesn't believe that there's any goodness left in him, because he tells her, "What did you think you'd find? A pitiful, hurt little puppy, a lost, misunderstood sweetheart?" And he goes even closer. "Oh, please, Lauren." And he's just in her face, looking down. And it's so tragic, because normally in webtoons, when we see images like this, it's when a couple is about to kiss and it's a sign of their closeness. And here it's just showing the complete irony, where this is the person that he's closest with, and that I do think he wishes he could be close with and intimate with. And he has to do this to push her even further away. I think there's this very tragic duality in what he's doing, where he does kind of want to approach her. The fact that he calls her darling, I don't think is incidental. I think it is intentional, it's deliberate, but maybe unconscious. I think that the words are slipping out of his mouth because he does feel closeness to Lauren and wishes he had somebody who could love him, who could respect him, and who could,
An equal.
Yeah. But he knows he can't. And then he just says the worst things to push them away.
I don't think it's just pushing away. It's more just, this is how I see myself. Why don't you see me this way? Like, it's him voicing everything he hates about himself. Like, I think too, as he's continuing his dialogue, I'll be honest, I took the a lost, misunderstood sweetheart personally. God damn it.
Yeah.
I know you're talking to us right now.
Yeah, I was
know
gonna
you're
say
saying that we misunderstood his character.
I was gonna say the line, "You knew who I was when we made our deal."
Yeah.
This is F and Soph talking directly to the audience. We knew who Kieran was. He committed murder, what, 8 episodes ago? Like, that's only 2 months. It's not that long in webtoon time. Like we knew who he was. We saw him report back to the Phantom Scythe. We saw him we knew he was an assassin. Like, I don't know how to say this. Like, we saw him covered in blood. We saw him fighting Lauren. We saw him reporting back to a messenger in a plague mask. He is a Phantom Scythe member, and that is something that got brushed over by the audience as we grew closer to him.
Yep, definitely.
And yeah, you should have known what was waiting for you. We should have known that this was coming, because there was no way to avoid it. This is who Kieran is as a character, right? Maybe this is who he believes he is, right? So it's gonna have to come up in some way, whether he is or actually isn't what they're saying right now. And just Lauren and Kieran, both of their characters at this point, you know, they're still very flawed and they're still at the beginning of their character journeys. So they're going to clash a lot.
Oh, actually, I was just thinking through like one of the things that just feels really dissonant. Like he sees himself as this horrible person, but I'm wondering if it's further than that, where he dehumanizes himself too, because he is trying to tear down the Phantom Scythe, you know, like there's some kind of moral compass or some kind of moral code that he's following. And I think that's why we felt ourselves believing in him and believing that he's a good person. But if we kind of flip the thinking a little bit, it could be that he saw Lauren as a way that he can be used to further a better outcome than if he just continued working with the Phantom Scythe. So I feel like he does not see himself as human, and he's like, how could anyone else see me as human? I thought you understood that I'm just here for a very specific reason. We agree on this cause, just use me to further this cause and forgive me of all the other things I have to do in my job type of thing.
Oh, that's
Mhm.
even sadder.
Just to
What?
finish my, oh, sorry.
For me, it almost kind of felt like um, a very like, how dare you make excuses for me?
Yeah.
Especially when he goes on to say like, you must be the only person, like he essentially calls Lauren delusional, but he's looking at the camera, quote unquote, like he's looking directly at us when he calls Lauren delusional for believing that he could be like a misunderstood sweetheart, or you know, like a sad hurt little puppy. Like it's very much like you were making excuses for me in your head, or like subconsciously of trying to defend me because you forgot what I am. And
Yeah.
I agree that it it very much is like him dehumanizing himself. I definitely agree with that. And I also think that he this episode is very much like the walls, including the fourth wall, has been broken down, and now it's just Kieran talking to like the audience and being, as well as Lauren, and being like, I'm like a monster, and you spent this entire season like trying to defend my actions, and you were wrong for doing so. Likely as a way of trying to distance himself from people who previously were sympathizing for him or trying to excuse his actions. In a way, he wound up kind of shooting himself in the foot later, and details I can't, I will not, I won't get into the details of that yet, but so it's definitely like, it felt like the audience was being chided in a way by the character for being like, you're trying to defend me, stop it.
Yeah, to finish my previous thought, the lines "a pitiful hurt little puppy" and "a lost misunderstood sweetheart," as Vita said, this is a direct call out to the audience, because these are tropes that we do see in media, and especially romance media, where, you know, it's the good girl and the bad guy, and the bad guy like starts off like very cold and stern, probably does a few bad things, if not, like, I don't know, depending on what media you're looking at, could be like the annihilation of planets, but that's a different problem. It's in these characters, these bad guys, always something like they're a pitiful hurt little puppy, or they're a lost and misunderstood sweetheart. And not only is Kieran calling out Lauren, the audience, he's also just calling out a whole trope in fiction, which I respect. I respect it. Because yeah, this is exactly what the audience expected of Kieran. We expected him to be this trope again, but Kieran isn't this trope. And I feel like this is Kieran's way of also trying to make sure that he gets accountability for his actions, because a lot of the times the audience is very good at shifting that accountability away. But Kieran himself, he does blame himself for what happened, right? So he wants that accountability.
Yeah. So well said. Wow, I love that. It's a great episode. So he continues and says, I am the purple hyacinth. And then he kind of puts his hand, to me, it looks like he's pretending to stroke her ear, at least in the beginning, which is supposed to be like affectionate, right? But to me, it's like that classic intimidating affectionate, where it's like, I'm going to make a move as though I am being kind, but really it's an intimidation move. It's kind of like the exact opposite. I don't know if you guys interpret it the same way. And we'll see what he does with his hand afterwards. But I think at least that beginning is supposed to be that way.
I saw it more as a distraction, kind of like pay attention to this hand, not this hand as I disarm you. Because like as we see in the next panel, that's exactly what he does. He takes the knife away from Lauren, chucks it across the room. I hope you don't mind him taking your job for you. And then Lauren is like, what the hell's going on? And we see Kieran just get her into this really into this hole that she just can't get out of. It reminds me a little bit of wrestling, where he just has her pinned quite literally against him. And like we see kind of like, you know, the change, again, a change not just in tone, but just an escalation of consequence. Like he is emotionally unstable, and it's pushing him to act not just irrationally, but also physically. And that is just not okay by anyone's standards.
Right. So, well, you know, now that I see that, I guess I could see it as a distraction, but I kind of do see it as that like ironic affection as well. And he says that while he's saying the reason sane people in the city don't sleep at night. Yeah, then he disarms her, you're right, with the other hand. And he also shoves her pistol off out of her to the floor. And then, yeah, now she's pinned against him, which is, again, the irony, because it ostensibly is like the closest they've ever been, or, well, they've kind of been shoved against each other several times. But, you know, in couples, it's almost like an embrace, but it's the exact opposite. It's such disturbing closeness. It's so well done. It's so well done. It's just astounding.
Yeah, but Kieran in this moment goes out of his way to disarm Lauren and make sure that she doesn't have any way of defending herself besides like taking him on like with her own bare fists. And like Lauren hasn't been physically aggressive up to this point. It's been completely on Kieran's and like all, well, like where the point where she's not pinning him or anything. She has gone up to him, but she hasn't tried to actively like physically hurt him.
I actually think I didn't view it as him trying to take away means of defending herself. To me, I saw it as like he was afraid that she would snap soon and try to hurt him. So I thought it was more of self-defense for him.
I think it's
Kieran's the emboldened one right now.
I do think that it's very much painting a picture of like the difference between like emotional like aggression versus physical aggression. Like like they're both almost like on par with the damage that they've done. Kieran just happened to be physical while Lauren's was emotional. The same amount of damage was dealt to them both, just in different kind of ways that they manifested. And neither the effects won't go away for either of them.
Sorry, please finish your thought.
No, it's fine. That was my whole point.
I actually don't completely agree. I'll be honest. It's more, and this is something that is talked about in the next couple chapters. Lauren has had a stable environment that she's grown up in, and the way that she deals with stress is a lot more socially acceptable, and she's a much more, what's the word? Well adjusted to society. Whereas Kieran, on the other hand, he is not. The way that he grew up was in the in the Phantom Scythe. And the way that he deals with stress is to think poorly of himself, lash out at others, and just bury whatever emotion that he's feeling, and kind of putting off any kind of self-reflection. And I think this is honestly just one way that we see that very unhealthy upbringing coming out, because this is how he interacts with, as mentioned before, probably one of the closest people he's ever had in his life. And it's not to talk through things, it's to deny himself any kind of humanity or compassion, and to physically lash out at her when he disagrees with what she's saying or is trying to make her see him in a poor light.
He's hurt. I think it's also that he's hurt.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And
Yeah, I agree
he's
with
got
you.
her trapped and pinned to him. He's holding both of her hands in one hand, and then his arm is around her neck. And Lauren is shaking. It looks like she's trying to get out of his grasp, and she says, "Let go of me." And Kieran just, he's right by her. Basically, they're cheek to cheek. Again, all the trappings of a romantic encounter, but it's the complete opposite, which is just beautiful, imagery. And it's so ironic and tragic. And he says, "I brutally slaughtered dozens of innocent people hours ago, didn't I? But I've done so much better than that." And again, it's like the rhetorical stuff. "I once carved a man's heart out of his chest and mailed it to his loved ones. Murdered an entire family, sat their corpses up in the living room, and waited all night for the father to come home." And his face there, like we don't see his eyes, we just see his mouth. And to me, even though he's trying to be sarcastic and not serious, it's a bitter set. "Oh, the look on his face before I stabbed him. Unforgettable." And like you said, he is completely, unforgettable could be interpreted like, "Oh, wow, I enjoyed it so much. It was so cool." But really unforgettable. He's been thinking about this since he did it. It's haunting him. That's the kind of unforgettable. But he is letting Lauren interpret it in the worst way.
And I think the color of his eyes really highlight that, because when he says, "I brutally slaughtered dozens of innocent people," first of all, it's in quotes, referencing what Lauren said before. And you could maybe say that brutally slaughtered is an opinion, or it could be something that he's lying about, which is why it ends on a question instead. It's not a period. And then you see like this gleam in his eye, and his face looks so freaking evil. I love it. I love it. Love this episode. And then when he goes back and he talks about the look on his face, unforgettable, which is not a lie. There is no light in his eye. He is remembering that moment and disassociating, and is in a really dark place.
Boy, it's so hard. And then he asks, "Do you remember December 12th, blank, blank, 24, Lauren?" "I do. That was the day I killed so many people at once." And we have like a flashback scene that the Hanbury Street literally ran red with their blood. And there is a bird's eye view of a street, and looks like bodies and the street running red. And he says, "Must have been horrible to clean up," which it sounds like purely flippant, but it's genuine.
I mean, he's reading these events like they're from a textbook.
Yeah.
So just a neutral third party. He doesn't, which is why it doesn't come off as a lie, because what he's saying are just facts, right? So,
Yeah.
you know, he's saying a fact about himself. That was the day I killed so many people at once. Hanbury Street literally ran red with the blood. Like, that was a fact. You know, it's not personal to him, which might just come off as a lie. And then the unforgettable line, it can go either way, right? Kieran knows in his own mind that it's going downhill, like it's unforgettable in a bad sense, but Lauren would take it as a sick, like, joy from it. That's what she would interpret it as, even though it's the opposite.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's just Lauren making assumptions right now, and Kieran kind of like carefully wording his phrases, so she takes it in the worst way possible.
Yeah, it's basically it's their flaws that they always have, just amplified a lot. Which is so true, by the way. As someone who has been in my fair share of arguments, let me tell you, it's very true that you cannot hurt someone unless you love them and know them so very, very well. The person that I have hurt the most is undoubtedly my husband, and the same for him, although we in very different ways. And it's all like, you talked about toxic, you said this is a toxic relationship before, and I actually disagreed, because I think that when people are very close, they can act very toxic to each other. It doesn't necessarily mean that the rest of their relationship, when they're not angry and fuming mad at each other, is toxic, but definitely when they have these kind of arguments, it's toxic. But yeah, it hits so true.
I think right now, like even before this, the relationship was still kind of toxic, because even if they weren't getting into massive arguments like this and you know, triggering the other and strangling and almost killing the other, the two were one in a very stressful situation, right? They were growing close in a very stressful situation because they're trying to take down a whole terrorist organization that has existed for the last decade, if not longer. And they've made it a rule between them where they can't get personal. So it's not like they can really be super open with one another. They're here strictly for business. And because of that, there's been a lot of lacking communication, because they both have their own motives and are both prioritizing those motives, because like those motives are very important to them. And so even if they weren't being emotionally and physically abusive to one another, that sort of relationship wouldn't be healthy in the long run, even if like they did have their moments, like 37. But even 37 is able to exist like that is because they are opening up more. So if they just kept their rules from, you know, episode 10 for the entire series, the relationship would not be healthy in any way.
Right.
I think even in 37, they weren't being.
Oh yeah, even
they
then.
they weren't being very personal, because they were still talking about their next infiltration mission being at the Carmen Camellia. Like, they weren't saying anything that was remotely personal. It's just that the context was them being like extremely close to one another. So it came across as personal even when it wasn't. So it's really unfortunate that like 43 wound up being like the single time that they wound up saying anything personal about each other. Like, because that's like painting like the no personal questions in the future in a negative light, because that to them is the consequences of being personal with one another. Like, or at least like it's gonna be tainted by the events of 43 being like, okay, well, the last time I was personal with you, you like called me a monster or something like that. Like, you know, it's very like, it's definitely like setting up some conflict in the future for if they do decide to get more personal with each other or to open up more on a personal level, outside of like the infiltrations or the information that they have, or like how information from their like time as loon translates into their personal lives. Like once they actually start digging deep into who they are as people, it's going to be really hard to get past that barrier of the events of this episode being as horrible as they were.
Yeah, sorry, I should have clarified. I still think that like there's, they still have a toxic relationship by the 37 point and 38. I think the episode in the next episode were a step in the right direction because they are more comfortable around each other, but even they could have had a million of those episodes and their relationship would still be toxic because a lot of the underlying issues would still exist and not be addressed. And this is why this episode needed to happen, because they have these issues. They have these issues that they've just been skirting around, but now that their motivations and their experiences are coming into clash, it does need to be addressed. And them addressing it, even if it is this way, is the only way that they can actually progress with their relationship and their mission.
I could not agree with you more, Fu. I think you're 100% right. I think they're never going to develop any kind of relationship unless they address the major problem between them. And this might have been like a very explosive way for them to address it, but it at least let the pressure out and they can continue the conversation afterwards in a less pressure environment. But 100%, there's no way they could have developed a real relationship if they didn't talk about the major problem.
Yeah, the elephant in the room.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wanted to ask Mindy, I wanted to be cognizant of time.
I asked them if we could push it off to 9:30, so let's maximum another 20 minutes. Thanks. Yeah, so let's continue. So now we have the massive dramatic moment, the crux of the episode. He grabs her by her neck and slams her into the cave wall, and he is choking her, holding her away from him, far away from him. This is also, I think, symbolic, where he's pushing her away and staring at her. And then he has this deathly expression on his face. He's totally disassociated. I think that's an excellent word. He's not himself anymore. He is just beyond thinking. He is not, I don't think he's really in control of his actions. He says, whatever the leader told me to do, I did it. I could strangle you with my bare hands and not shed a single tear. And the expression in his face then is demonic. His eyes are wide open. He is, I don't know exactly what words to describe it, but he's kind of, I feel like he's having some kind of like out of body experience. Like, I don't think he is there. And she is meanwhile just choking and trying to detach his hand. It's one hand, by the way. He only has her with one hand, and she still can't get his hand off of her neck. And she's like panicking. He says, why do you seem so surprised? And he just is yelling, like you said, I am a monster. And it's the worst face ever. It is so vivid and scary and tragic.
Yeah.
What else is there to say? I mean, it speaks for itself.
I mean, reading this episode for the first time, it's absolutely horrifying. Like, just seeing Kieran in this state and what he's doing, it really, this moment here really drives home like one of the major points of this episode, that this is who Kieran is. This is the purple hyacinth. He is the purple hyacinth. And even if Kieran like had no control over the events that brought him to this point of his life, this is still part of his character, and this is still something that he has to deal with, and something that is his problem, even if it isn't his fault.
Yeah.
I actually think that this whole
by his fault, I mean like the Phantom Scythe isn't his fault. However, this moment here, I'm kind of torn about, because I do kind of hold him accountable for this, because I don't really think the Phantom Scythe was directly telling him or forcing him in any way to strangle Lauren. And so that's why I don't like Kieran that much, because he did do this. Even if he was dissociating, he did do this without any Phantom Scythe influence.
So I think that this reaction is the result of a normal, kind, not psychopathic person reacting to the abuse and trauma that he's been through. I think that it's kind of like what you can, it's really direct the parallel, child soldiers who have been conscripted at a young age, torn away from their families, shoved into warfare. They come out of that messed up. Can you say it's their fault? It's very, very difficult, but yes and no. But this is what happens when you take a person who has a soul, who has guilt and moral conscience, and make him do things that are despicable, and you have a broken human being at the end of it. And I'll give you an example of something I saw personally. My husband has a very good friend who was intensively abused as a kid. Like, his parents were crazy abusive to the point that it killed one of his siblings by beating them up so hard. It was like, and they blinded one of the other ones. They poked their kid's eye out with a hanger, like the most intensive, disgusting, horrible kind of abuse you can imagine. And so he grew up like in that environment, and he left, right? He obviously didn't want to be there. He married someone who grew up in a very normal, healthy, stable, middle-class family. He also grew up very poor. And they had a terrible marriage because of completely different backgrounds, expectations. Her dad had been like a lawyer, massive, like pretty comfortable. He was like, he worked like the, very, very low pay jobs because that was what he had come from, and he couldn't do anything else. And so they had a lot of clashes, one time we saw that he had put aside money for the rent for the next day. We were in the house at the time, and he lost it. It was like $500, lived in a poor neighborhood, and he couldn't find the money. He had just had it before, and he couldn't find it. He flipped out. Like, I never saw anyone flip out that way. He started turning over furniture, throwing glass objects, and he was screaming, and he had lost control because he was working his butt off, trying to make money. He had so much built-in stress in his life that he had never addressed, that he had never dealt with. And when he lost that money, they also did not have money, he just flipped. And that reaction was incredible to see. It was frightening, but it was also very understandable, knowing what he had gone through. And it really reminds me of this, where he just flips out because he has gone through so much, and he's just been triggered and pushed to that point, and he's broken. He's like gone.
And just to add on to that too, it feels like, especially the last couple of sentences, it feels like a very childish response. Like, we see a little boy kind of yelling at, I don't know, someone, like maybe a cat that doesn't know how else to act other than a cat, for example. And exactly like you were saying, there was just some kind of emotional development that didn't happen. So they're stuck in a very immature mentality. And especially when he's yelling, like you said, I am a monster. And the way that he is yelling, like, it's horrific, it's sad, it's heartbreaking. But to me, there's also a very childlike quality too, because he's not saying this in a calm manner, like, oh, why do you think that I'm this way? I see myself as not a human. No, of course, that's not how he's going to phrase it. He doesn't have that emotional intelligence because he never learned it. And at that point, when he's at this emotional peak, is when, he lets the one lie slip in the whole chapter.
Mm-hmm. I think Kieran's time in the Phantom Scythe and the Phantom Scythe itself, I think that explains his actions in this episode. However, I don't think it excuses it. Because he wasn't ordered to do this or anything. However, the orders did impact his life and did make him into the person he is today, right? Having to be the purple hyacinth and being forced into that position. So although like his actions are understandable because of his experiences, however, personally, for me, okay, like this isn't everyone, it's just me. Personally, for me, it doesn't excuse his actions in this moment.
So I think for this, I think what the choices we have to make as human beings is, when do we choose to forgive someone and to understand them? And, I'm not Kieran, right? I've never done murders, but there are moments in my life that I know I've said things I shouldn't have said because I was angry, because I was stressed, because I was going through years of my life that were extremely miserable. And were they excusable? I shouldn't have done it. Were they understandable? Yes. So I think the choice that the people that we live with have to make, in this case, my husband, is, can I forgive this person and understand the context? And is there enough good in the rest of the time to move on and to accept that and to say, okay, so this happened once and it doesn't happen again. And she said, I'm sorry. And she's working on making things better. So, I think it's like, we always say, okay, well, why do people stay with abusive people? Because they love them, right? Because they see the good in them, because they understand their background. And I think the kind of like this, where the scale flips is, how often does it happen? Are they working on making things better? Is it rare? Is it not? Or is it just all the time? And, I think that Soph and F present a really, really complicated and very relevant moral dilemma here with Kieran, because we know he's a person who was ripped away from a normal, well, I don't know what his life was before, but he was forced into this situation. And then the question we all ask ourselves is, can we forgive him for what he does? Can we, knowing what we know about his background, can we forgive him? And I think it's extremely relevant, because there's people all over the world who don't grow up with our sheltered lives, who have had experiences that make them into less than ideal people. And I think that it's extremely relevant for us as people, this dilemma here.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's
To a
difficult
certain
to
extent.
give my opinion on this type of thing. Sorry. I think I agree with like the both of you, in a sense where I think that he very clearly was in the wrong here. And I don't think anybody should forget that he was in the wrong here. But I also think that, like you said, it's a very, like, I guess, complicated situation where it's not a very consistent pattern of behavior. Like, we've maybe seen an action similar to what happened in 43 previously with the alley scene after they got to Anslo. However, that was a very small scale thing. And so it's very difficult to kind of like fully blame, or not blame, but fully like paint him as this irredeemable kind of person, because that isn't necessarily the case. What he did was irredeemable, but he inherently is not irredeemable. And I think that in terms of forgiveness, I personally am of the opinion that it's not our place as the audience to forgive him, it's Lauren's. She was the one who was wronged. It's up to her to figure out whether or not she can forgive and learn to trust him again after the events of 43. Like, we can obviously give our input and express like our opinions on, like, what we deem as acceptable or unacceptable in this situation, but at the end of the day, we weren't the ones who were wronged. We weren't in Lauren's shoes. We are viewing this the way that we would view like a play, and we give input like we would on a piece of media. So that's kind of like the most that I could fully like explain it, in a sense that's at its most neutral. My personal opinion, like, if I were Lauren, that would be like my line in the sand. However, I'm not Lauren, none of us are. So none of us have like the full idea of her psyche and her process of forgiveness to really kind of like understand, get to a point where we can understand where he's coming from and her understanding of where he's coming from, and then forgiveness coming from that. I don't think I'm making any sense. If I need to clarify something, let me know. I'm sorry.
No, that's a really good point. Don't worry, you make a lot of sense. Yeah, that's really true. And ultimately, you're right. It's not up to us on whether Kieran can really be forgiven or not. It's up to the people whose lives he affected. It's up to like, the families of his victims and the friends of his victims. And, you can't bring back the victims, right? But you can't bring back all the people like who Kieran killed, but you can try to make the reparations with the people who are still left.
So now the final line that he says is
Just give my opinion real quick. I'll keep
Yeah,
it
sure.
really short. I think that's just the beauty of this comic, to be honest, because when I first read this episode, I was like, I never really agreed with Kieran's what he's doing. Like inherently, like I'm definitely more with is it Fwoot?
Yeah.
But what I love is the fact that it doesn't really matter what you personally think. It's more, there's so much teasing out to do. And to me, it's a very interesting thought experiment, like exactly like you guys were mentioning too. To what extent will you actually forgive him as the story progresses? So yeah, that's been a really interesting journey, just like for myself, just seeing how my feelings about Kieran change throughout the entire story, because it's a roller coaster. And again, it's a topic of conversation. And I think it's been really well done because as a character, he's really, really cool. He's a really great character.
Oh, yes, definitely. I 100% agree with that. A lot of the times you can find me just hating on Kieran, and like half the times it's a joke. But for me personally, like Vita, I want to see Kieran progress over the story. Although, like, I want to see him work to be forgiven by the characters if they will forgive him, and I want him to make the efforts to try and redeem himself, because a lot of the times in media and fiction, people will try to redeem real people and also fictional characters just because of their past or their potential. But at the end of the day, if someone wants to be a better person and they've done bad things, they need to work for it. Their past and their history can't be their only qualifying factor.
right. It really depends on what he does next. So
Mhm.
we can't judge yet until we see what he will continue to do. And speaking of the past, this is the line that he says that makes it all more complex, because he says, yes, I am a monster and I have always been like this. And that's the lie. And that's like the save the cat moment, which is in screenwriting, there's this book, Save the Cat, where Blake Snyder, who's the author, says you have to have a moment where we feel something for the character. We see there's redeemability in the character, where there's something that we like about the character. And this is it, because this is the saving grace of Kieran, where we know he hasn't always been like this, that he really, deep down, he isn't a monster. He's not what he says he is. And the way that Lauren's reaction is portrayed is stunning, because everything goes white and she looks up at him and you can kind of see time freeze where she catches that. And as much as she's in, this panic of being choked, she just seems to stop and freeze at hearing that. And like you see her hands are actually like kind of loosening up, like they stop, trying to grapple his hands away from her neck, because she's so shocked at hearing this. And Kieran himself is shocked that he says it. He opens his eyes up and then he just steps back and lets go, because he's so shocked that he said this and that he basically admitted the vulnerability and that this came out of him. And Lauren bends over, she's coughing, Kieran, still with an extremely shocked look on his face, just steps backwards even more. She's coughing again, and he turns around, like he can't look at her. And I think this is him being unable to, he's finally like back to himself. His brain has gone back in, and he's like, oh, like, what did I just do? Like, I think he can't stand to look at what he just did to Lauren.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because if he looks at Lauren, then he's looking at the consequences of his actions, is exactly what he was avoiding at the beginning of the episode.
And this just digs him deeper into the hole of self-hatred, where he's like, I'm a monster, I do terrible things. And now look, I just choked the one person who I had a bit of a burgeoning relationship with. I mean, this is just the worst thing he could have done for everybody, for Lauren and for himself. But then he has, now that his wits are back, he kind of has, this is, I think, his verbal way of getting back at her. This is a little bit of a revengey kind of thing that he's saying. He says, but that's not what this is about, is it? And Lauren's like the shocked. You're smart. You wouldn't have agreed to a deal without being fully aware of the possible consequences. And you also knew I couldn't ignore the leader's message. If I don't act like I've always done, he would suspect something is wrong, and then we would both be dead. You aren't, and now he turns around and looks at her. You aren't mad because I killed these people. You're mad because I killed Anslo. And she says, what? How can you say that? How can you say it like it's all that mattered? Which is true. It's not all that mattered, right? She was upset also because of the moral reason. And he continues, this is about you and what you found in Anslo's belongings. You're angry because now you won't be able to get anything more out of him. And Lauren's just upset. How can you even claim that's all this is about? And then he says, and I think this is him trying to, in a way, have a little bit of self-preservation and think that he's not as bad, and to pull her down to the mud with him. He says, how incredibly ironic. You condemn me for my crimes, but who's worse between us, Lauren? The ruthless criminal or the selfish hypocrite? And this is like, he's using her vulnerability and her weakness, her weak point, to strike at her, because he knows the truth in this, and only the truth can hurt you. If it wasn't true, it wouldn't hurt.
I think part of it too, sorry, what was that? Yeah, I was just gonna say too, I think part of it was just him lashing out again, because he felt like he had the upper hand and the control and in control of his emotions, even though he was lashing out. Like, he was the one that was physically restraining her, talking to her, asking her, like, how could you think that I am a human with very complex thoughts, or such and such. And when he made a mistake, instead of owning up to it, or unpacking what that even means, he says, oh, by the way, I think you're a hypocrite. So it's just, he's still punishing her in a sense, or lashing out at her because he made a mistake, which again is like a very immature reaction to the entire sequence of events.
Mm-hmm. However, he is right, though. I mean, he's lashing out at her, but he is right in this. And
I don't know.
Yeah, they're in this. I mean, what he says about her is kind of correct. That is, like, because she is mad that he killed Onslow, because she had plans to visit Onslow, and Onslow was important to her personally because she wanted to find out information about the photo she found. But the photo she found wasn't it wasn't really related to Luna. It was more just related to her own history.
It's not the whole story though, because if she was only interested in revenge, like, she didn't have to become a cop. At the end of the day, I see Lauren as an extension of the audience to some extent, because especially in this episode, I feel like us and Lauren are in the same boat. If someone were to kill the amount of people that Kieran killed, we would feel mournful for it. And I think he's actually using that as a dig to get to her, saying, hey, you're a hypocrite. So then Lauren's thinking to herself, oh, you just killed all these people, and I feel bad because of the one person. No, I think that was more just him trying to really dig at her and really hit a sore note, because that might be her worst perception of herself, but it's not the only truth. She is mournful that so many people died.
Well, yeah, I
Both
think
of them then. It's
I
kind of
think
like a
for
parallel
Lauren-
situation.
I think for Lauren, it does matter that people died, but ultimately it's Onslow that is what really got her, because Kieran has
I disagree.
Kieran has killed people before. She just found out that Kieran killed an entire family, but she was never mad about that.
Is-
Or like she wasn't expressively mad as she was about the tower killings. So like, and
That happened
because
before she knew him.
Yeah.
yeah, I mean Lauren was aware of all of these murders that Kieran had committed, right? But she never expressed this amount of anger over them. Hell,
But
she even
complicit this-
encountered him right after he had killed two people because she was called in as backup. But like Lauren, she did call him a monster there, but in the way that she reacted here, she reacted this way because it got personal for her.
Now she knows him. Before that, she didn't know him.
I mean,
Now
yeah,
she has
she
a
knows him
relationship with
now.
him.
She knows him now, and she's in a state of shock because she got comfortable around him, right? As the audience. But before, the people that Kieran killed didn't matter to Lauren as much. And we even see this with Kim. Kim is able to make jokes and like in front of a corpse. But then when Kim meets Harvey, or sorry, not when she meets Harvey, when she sees Harvey's body, right? It matters to Kim because Harvey was an important person to her. And it's the same with Lauren and Onslow. Yes, I'm pretty sure both of these characters do care about Kieran's other victims and like any other victims by the Golden Viper. They do care about these victims, but ultimately they also do really care about the victims that were important to them because they had their own personal interests in that character, whether it be Harvey as Kim's friend and co-worker, or whether it be Onslow as Lauren's road to answers.
Yeah. So anyway, we have like about 1 minute left. So I want to finish the last couple of panels. And we did kind of discuss this issue also in the next episode, which we recorded it, right? So Lauren's, reaction to this is she opens her eyes wide and then she gets extremely angry, and you see her fist is shaking and it looks like she wants to punch him, and she opens her mouth, looks like she's about to start yelling, but then she closes it and just says, sure. And I think that's a very smart decision on her part, because she realized that the conversation was not going to get anywhere. It's going to get worse and worse and worse because nobody was in the right state of mind to actually converse. And she just decides to leave. She turns around, picks up her coat, and walks out of the cave, and leaving Kieran looking after her, which is actually the smartest thing she could have done. Because when you're both in a state, and this is for any argument, trust me, we regular human beings have this kind of stuff all the time. When neither of you are being productive and you're just being angry, just go away. Better to just leave. You're not going to get anywhere. And so that was pretty smart of Lauren to leave at that moment.
Yeah, she chose to de-escalate instead of continuing this, because it could have led to, she didn't know where it could go. Like she just got strangled. She almost died. So yeah, she just chose to leave. She didn't say anything. She didn't make any snarky comment, and she just chose to let it be.
Which I think just highlights the difference between Kieran and Lauren. She has that emotional intelligence to know when to walk away, whereas Kieran doesn't.
And I just want to say, because Mindy, I'm so sorry, I know you're short on time, but I just want to say
30
this.
seconds or less for everybody.
I know, but this episode was the episode that made me realize how much I loved Purple Hyacinth, and it is what ended up getting me into the fandom. So although this episode is absolutely horrible, in its content. It's just so well written and absolutely like beautiful to read, and is honestly just like, as a aspiring writer myself, it is really inspiring to read, and just the skill and mastery that went into making this episode and just all the buildup it had, perfection, absolutely perfection. It's what makes season 1 so great. And yeah, I love this episode a lot.
So Vita and Allo, do you have any final closing thoughts? And very briefly, I know we already discussed this quite extensively.
Just like a small kind of appreciation for just this particular episode was just really well written, and I think like F deserves a lot of appreciation for the skill, the sheer amount of skill that went into this episode, as well as like just the general like Soph's art. This is just one of the most masterfully done episodes like of like the entire story, in my personal opinion. So I mean, that's kind of it.
F deserves so much credit for this episode. Like, we don't give F enough credit, because PH has amazing writing and amazing art. And yeah, just F appreciation.
I personally love the horror quality that they were able to incorporate, just that emotional abyss that we see in Kieran, and then we see Lauren as a compliment, both how she was a victim of that abyss and how she decided not to fall into it with him. Absolutely beautiful episode. I really hope I don't see Kieran's dead eyes again, because as much as I love the horror aspect and quality of it, I want him to see a therapist and get better. Yeah. So
last panel,
and so
the dead eyes, describes the last panel pretty well, where he's just looking after her with that mixture of still anger, disappointment, self-loathing, depression. It's perfect. It's so well done. How much you can read in people's emotions, like their faces, amazing. Well, thank you so much. This episode was truly outstanding to record with you guys. Everyone here contributed in like the most amazing ways. So thank you so much, because I really think the podcast would be a fraction of what it is if it were just me. So everyone coming on here just makes it so much richer. And I really appreciate you coming on and sharing all your insights. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having us. Have a good night, ladies.
Thank you for having us. This was very fun to record. I loved discussing it with you guys.
Good night.
Thank you so much to my current patrons: Susie, Lady Libris, Lily, Jenny, Haley, Maria, Molly, Veronica, Emily, Joe, Rochelle, Saucy Talgos, Meg, and Rose, Priya, Alexa, Misty, Laura, Joanne, Patty, Jen, Imelda, Esther, I'm Watching You, Taurus, Poppy Seed, Marie, Jen, Emily, Jean, Jen, Erin, D, and Kay. Your support is truly appreciated.